In the year 1099, a devastating natural disaster struck the coasts of England and the Netherlands, causing catastrophic floods that would be remembered for centuries. The event, known as the Great Coastal Floods of 1099, was one of the earliest recorded instances of extreme flooding along these shores. This disaster affected large areas of the North Sea coast, including parts of Belgium, and caused immense loss of life and property. The floods hit at a time when communities in these regions were highly vulnerable, with many living near rivers and coastal areas that were prone to flooding. The earliest records of these floods come from England, particularly in the area around the Thames Estuary. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions that the sea came out upon the shore with a force and scale that had never been witnessed before. Reports from the time indicate that a significant portion of land was submerged, including a famous estate owned by Earl Goodwin, which would later become known as the Goodwin Sands. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, the floodwaters caused similar devastation, with coastal villages and towns overwhelmed by the rising tides. This disaster is said to have claimed the lives of around 100,000 people, making it one of the deadliest floods in history. These coastal floods were not just limited to one area, but spread across various regions, from the River Thames in England to the low-lying coasts of the Netherlands. This widespread flooding was an unprecedented event, shocking communities across both countries. It marked a tragic point in history, setting the stage for further discussions about the causes and impact of such natural disasters in the years to come. The Great Coastal Floods of 1099 were triggered by a powerful combination of natural forces that took the people of England and the Netherlands by surprise. Leading up to the disaster, weather patterns had become increasingly unstable, and a series of heavy storms began to build along the North Sea coastlines. These storms intensified in strength, creating what historians now suspect was a wind-driven storm surge. This surge, combined with an exceptionally high tide, pushed vast amounts of seawater inland, overwhelming the coastal defenses. In England, the riverbanks of the Thames were already vulnerable, but the sudden surge made any preparations impossible. Towns near the Thames Estuary and along the English coast found themselves facing a rising wall of water with little warning. The people, unaware of the scale of the threat, had no way to prepare for the destruction that was coming. Similarly, in the Netherlands, the low-lying coastal areas stood no chance against the fast-approaching storm surge. Villages and farms were situated dangerously close to the sea, and once the tide began to rise, there was little time to react. On the first day of the flood, the water levels surged at an alarming rate, catching many off guard. Communities along the English and Dutch coasts scrambled to protect themselves, but the sheer force of the storm overwhelmed them. The floodwaters crept further inland than ever before, submerging vast stretches of land. Houses, crops, and livestock were washed away as the flood moved relentlessly forward. These early hours of the flood set the stage for the widespread devastation that would follow in the days to come. As the Great Coastal Floods of 1099 unfolded, the sheer power and devastation became more apparent with each passing day. The rising waters surged through England and the Netherlands, sweeping away everything in their path. In England, the Thames River overflowed its banks in multiple areas, especially near the river's mouth, where the low-lying lands offered little resistance. The waters reached deep into the countryside, drowning entire villages and farmlands. The famous estate of Earl Goodwin was submerged completely, and the area soon became what we now know as Goodwin Sands. The Netherlands faced similar destruction. Low-lying coastal regions were flooded quickly, and homes, farms, and even entire communities were swallowed by the rising tide. People who lived close to the coast had nowhere to flee as the water advanced faster than expected. In both countries, the floodwaters moved with such force that they carried away not only buildings and animals, but also people. Thousands were swept out to sea or trapped by the waters as they rose. The loss of life was catastrophic. Many chronicles from the time describe how men, women, and children were buried beneath the water, with their homes and possessions disappearing in the waves. In England, the flooding was particularly severe near the Thames Estuary, but the disaster reached much further inland than anyone could have predicted. The destructive force of the floodwaters reshaped the landscape, leaving behind ruins, debris, and stories of incredible loss. The flood raged on for days, with high tides and strong winds making any rescue efforts nearly impossible. The people left behind were forced to endure days of relentless flooding, watching as their world was washed away. By the time the waters finally began to recede, the damage was already immense, and the full impact of the disaster was just beginning to be understood. The aftermath of the Great Coastal Floods of 1099 left both England and the Netherlands in ruins. The destruction to the land and infrastructure was immense, with vast stretches of farmland completely ruined by the salty floodwaters. Crops were wiped out, leading to severe food shortages in the affected areas. Homes that had stood for generations were now nothing more than wreckage, their remains scattered across the waterlogged landscape. In England, the areas near the Thames Estuary were among the hardest hit. Villages that once thrived along the riverbanks were gone, leaving only debris behind. The estate of Earl Goodwin, once a symbol of prosperity, was swallowed by the flood and transformed into a vast sandbank, which came to be known as Goodwin Sands. The flooding reshaped parts of the English coastline, creating new sandbanks and altering the flow of rivers. Thousands of acres of land were left unusable, buried under mud and debris. The floodwaters also destroyed livestock and essential food stores, further straining the surviving population. In the Netherlands, the low-lying coastal regions suffered even greater devastation. The floods overwhelmed the protective dikes, causing even more widespread destruction. Entire villages disappeared beneath the waters, and the fertile farmlands were turned into desolate wastelands. The Dutch coastline, which had already been vulnerable, was drastically altered by the floods, with vast sections of land reclaimed by the sea. The destruction was not just physical. The floods also took a heavy toll on the people, leaving behind a traumatized population, many of whom had lost family, homes, and livelihoods. The loss of life was staggering, with reports suggesting that up to 100,000 people perished in the floods. Both England and the Netherlands faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives, but the scale of the destruction made recovery difficult. In the months and years that followed, the survivors struggled to find shelter, food, and resources, as much of what they relied on had been washed away. The long-term impact of the great coastal floods was felt for years, as the affected regions faced famine, disease, and economic hardship in the wake of the disaster. The great coastal floods of 1099 left an indelible mark on both England and the Netherlands, shaping their history in profound ways. The massive loss of life, with an estimated 100,000 people killed, remains one of the most tragic natural disasters of the medieval period. The physical landscape was forever altered, with sandbanks like Goodwin Sands serving as a constant reminder of the devastation. The floods reshaped coastlines and claimed fertile lands, leaving behind a legacy of loss and hardship for the survivors. In the immediate aftermath, communities had to rebuild from scratch. The floodwaters had not only destroyed homes and infrastructure, but also wiped out food supplies and livestock, leading to famine in some regions. Disease spread in the unsanitary conditions that followed the flood, further compounding the suffering of the population. Both England and the Netherlands were forced to rethink their flood protection measures. In the centuries that followed, particularly in the Netherlands, stronger dikes and flood defenses were developed as a response to the vulnerabilities exposed by the disaster. The great coastal floods of 1099 also left a deep psychological impact on the people of the time. Stories and legends about the floods, such as the tale of Goodwin Sands, were passed down through generations, serving as both warnings and memories of the unpredictable power of nature. For those who survived, the disaster was a stark reminder of their fragility in the face of natural forces beyond their control. Ultimately, the great coastal floods of 1099 were a turning point in how people in both England and the Netherlands viewed their relationship with the sea. The disaster underscored the need for greater protection and planning to prevent future tragedies, and it set the stage for the development of more advanced flood defense systems in the centuries to come. Despite the immense destruction, the resilience of the survivors and the lessons learned from this catastrophe became part of the enduring history of these coastal nations.